All right. How's everybody feeling? Woo? Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Jewel Burks Solomon, and I'm super excited to be leading this Fireside chat. Geoff, you have an amazing background for this particular topic, and I know we have a lot of people here from all over who I'm sure are very curious about what are the essential pieces of advice they need to build their startup, maybe in Silicon Valley or maybe outside of Silicon Valley.
Right.
So out of curiosity, raise your hand if you're building a startup outside of Silicon Valley. Hi. Wow.
Well, looks
Awesome.
like most of them.
Yeah. So just before we kind of kick it off, curious if you can share your background. What's led you to where you are today? Give us a little bit of grounding in who you are.
Sure. Well, hey, everyone. I'm going to be brief because I've been around for a long time, and I could just use the whole half an hour giving that background. I started as a programmer for HP a long time ago, and from there I became an entrepreneur. I've started 4 or 5 companies, depending on how you count, and one of those companies got bought, and I became an executive at a large company, then at a small company again. That company got bought, and after that I became an investor and an advisor to startups. And sort of in that time frame, I became a partner at Y Combinator about 8 years ago, and since then I've been at YC.
Awesome. And YC has really been based in Silicon Valley, but you all...
We started in Cambridge, actually.
Oh, okay.
So talking about building startups outside of Silicon Valley, the really sort of super condensed story of YC is that Paul Graham gave this talk at the Harvard Computing Society in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called How to Start a Startup. And from that, him and his then girlfriend, now wife, Jessica Livingston, decided to start something called the Summer Founders Program, which took place in Cambridge, and that was the first batch of YC in the spring of 2005.
Awesome. So
we started outside of Silicon Valley, but a year later we moved to Mountain View, and we've been there ever since.
Yeah. So speaking of that, just kind of thinking through that story, curious what was the pull to Silicon Valley and what kind of has kept YC in Silicon Valley for all these years?
It's a good question. What's the pull of Silicon Valley for startups? What's the magic in Silicon Valley that has made it such an extraordinarily fertile place to start startups? Well, Paul, PG, saw that was the place. He had started a couple of startups before Y Combinator, and he just knew, he just had this sense that the future of most startups in that time frame were going to was going to start in Silicon Valley. So it made sense for him to move out. In fact, they sort of just came out and didn't really have a place to stay. And luckily, one of the co-founders of Y Combinator was also starting a robotics company called AnyBots. And he had lots of extra space in this kind of strange building at 320 Pioneer Way in Mountain View. And we actually still are in that building to this day. We have another building across the street because we've expanded, but ever since then, we've been in Silicon Valley.
Awesome. So now, fast forward many years, and seeing
15 years.
15 years.
Time flies, right?
And seeing the audience that we have and knowing that a lot of people are founding businesses outside of Silicon Valley, what do you think are those magic pieces that need to be potentially recreated or are necessary in the other places where folks are starting businesses?
I don't know what you guys think, but one of the things that makes starting a business in Silicon Valley so natural and so normal is, I call it sort of the salad bar effect, which is, imagine you go into a grocery store and you're just going to grab a salad bar because you have no time to do anything else for dinner because you're doing a startup, and so you have no time for anything. And you're sitting there making your salad, and you bump into someone you know. And in Silicon Valley, the conversation naturally goes to, so like, what are you doing? And I'm starting a startup, and they're like, yeah, so am I. That's awesome. That's great. And you start talking, and maybe they are, or maybe they're not. But it's so exciting to be doing a startup. But in so many other places of the country and in the world, if you tell someone you're starting a startup, they'll be like, oh, damn, couldn't get a job? You okay? And that may be a bit a bit of an exaggeration, but there is something in the air, in the water, in the soil of Silicon Valley that makes it natural, that makes it okay to do something that has such a high chance of failure, that is so difficult, and pays so little until it doesn't, right? And so there is this sense here that starting a startup is a viable, real, powerful alternative for your career. And that's not necessarily true in other places. Now, we also, of course, have Sand Hill Road here, which is shorthand for venture money. And startups need fuel. They need that money, and there is a lot of it here. It started because back in 1957, this strangely named firm called ARDC invested $70,000 in this company that, actually, who knows? Who's heard of Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC? Yeah? Well, they were one of the early computer companies, and they invested $70,000 in that company. And when they went public, they made $35 million. It's pretty good, right? And a lot of people saw that and said, that's pretty good. And they came out to Sand Hill Road, which, that's where they were, and that's where a lot of these companies were being started because of, Stanford and Berkeley and the other universities that are in the local area. So you had lots of people who had the skills necessary to start companies. And so that's part of what makes Silicon Valley special. But of course, there's great universities around the world, and there's availability of funds around the world and around the country. So those things aren't nearly as special as that special culture that I think is getting built in other places around the world and the country.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm in Atlanta, so I believe we have a really cool culture that's emerging there. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what does it take to be successful as a startup? So you could found the business anywhere. Geoff, I think you have a lean towards Silicon Valley, but curious, what are the key elements for the startup itself? What does it need to be successful?
Yeah, most companies that do YC end up leaving. A lot do stay in Silicon Valley. Some are from Silicon Valley. But you should go where your startup has the best chance of success. That usually means where your customers are. So if your customers are all in New York, maybe you should go there. The Airbnb guys in 2009, they were never in Mountain View. They were always in New York because their early customers were in New York. Now, of course, look, it didn't matter where they were, and they ended up everywhere, but basing their company in San Francisco. But they could have been anywhere. So you do want to go where your customers are. That's maybe because I hope some of you have seen the blog post that myself and Michael Seibel wrote called Essential Startup Advice. And there's some really basic, but I think good advice in there, like, talk to your customers, right? That seems pretty obvious, but you should talk to your customers. But one thing that sometimes people miss is that you have to do it forever, always. It's an iterative process. We tend to tell people that a simple recipe for making a great startup is to talk to customers and write software. Okay, so if you're not a software company, you can put, build stuff, and then do that forever. Find out how you deliver value, what the best way your product can deliver value, and then do that. And you only can really do that by being as close to your customer as you can.
So being close to customers. What else?
Well, be close to your network.
Yeah.
A lot of times, your first employees will be people you know or people who you know. And so building that initial startup team, if you think about it, if you're going to build a billion-dollar company, you better start with a core of incredible people who you trust and who are going to be with you through thick and thin. So you should go where your network is.
Awesome. And something that we were talking about a little bit backstage, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on, is how do you know if it's not working? How do you know if you're failing?
We're going to get that to I don't know if they want to know about how they know if
Yeah, we got to get to it.
We tell the startups at YC a lot that, if you want to know if you're failing, just ask. And sometimes that's actually the best way because you're so involved in what you're doing, you might not be paying attention to what's going on. So to have a trusted advisor who you can say, do you think things are going well from an objective standpoint? I think the easiest way to tell if you're failing or not is to ask yourself a super simple question. which is the motto of YC, is have you made something people want? Can you actually say that? A lot of times this is conflated with product market fit and ideas like that, but you can ignore that. Have you made something that really delivers value to customers? And you know that. They really love your product. They couldn't live without it. If you read Essential Startup Advice, we talk about the Paul Buchheit role. Paul Buchheit, a partner at Y Combinator and the inventor of Gmail. And we have a friendly competition because I was involved in the creation of Yahoo Mail. So it's really friendly. He usually wins the thing, but it's still friendly. He has his rule of 10, or sometimes rule of 100, which means find 10 users who really deeply love what you've done and expand from there. Don't find 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or more who kind of sort of like it and will drop it at the drop of a hat. Find the people who love you. And if you have built a product like that, then you're probably not failing, not yet. There might be other things that get in your way, but that's the most important place to start. And you can easily kid yourself, fool yourself about whether you've really done that or not, which is why you need to be close to your customers and really figure that out. Really ask yourself that question. If you went away tomorrow, would anyone notice? Would anyone care? Would it matter? Not you personally, but your company.
Your business. So you have had a great career as far as angel investing and now investing through YC. I'm curious, for you, what are the key things that you're looking for when you're evaluating companies?
So this is sort of the most common question we get, like it's all wrapped up into how you get into YC and what do we care about?
Yep.
What does it matter? What matters to us? For sure, the most important thing to us is the team, is their resilience, their toughness, their kind of hard to describe ability to become these formidable founders of multi-billion-dollar companies. We want to see that potential in a founder, and if we see or sense that potential, then we almost don't care what you're doing. We do. I mean, having some insight into some idea, even if we think it's a bad idea, is really important. But, an example we'd like to use is the guys from Brex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these were two very young founders from Brazil who had this virtual reality idea, which, wasn't that good an idea, but they were awesome. And during the batch, they pivoted to really a much better idea, a space they knew much better, actually, fintech. And, now they're just another Y Combinator billion-dollar company.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about that grit, the kind of qualities that are hard to show on paper, how do you sense that when you're talking to a founder? What are the key elements that kind of bring that out for you?
There's a bunch, and it has to do with how we read applications and what you've said on the application, what you've done before, what you've built, what sort of experience you have. And then when we get in front of you, our interviews are, I don't know, has anyone here been in a YC interview? They're kind of intense, right? And the reason for the intensity isn't accidental. It's partially because we only have 10 minutes and we have a lot to get through, but partially is we're testing you. We're trying to understand what you know, what you're made of, how you respond to difficult questions rapidly. It's actually less interesting how well you've prepared, but more interesting if we can, we'll come up with something you haven't thought of and see how you think on your feet and how you deal with, someone who's just like focusing in super hard on the things that might go wrong with your business. Because there is no business for which you cannot, throw stones. It's easy. They're always, you can say, I'll go back to my Airbnb case, right? Who funds a company that's doing airbeds in people's homes when there's overflow from conferences? Who funds that? Well, if you look at Brian and Joe and Nate, and you understand how they had been struggling and fighting for years because they believed in something bigger, and I wasn't there. I can take no credit for that, but Paul and those who did that interview saw that.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what is the difference between a company that goes through YC and goes on to be super successful and a company that goes through YC and doesn't have that same level of success? What's the difference between those two?
Well, the founders of the first one are a lot richer.
Fair.
You know, that's a complicated question, and there's no simple answer. What does create success? Sometimes it's just that the founders were that good or that lucky, or the idea that they had plus their abilities was the perfect match, and it matched the timing of the market and all the macroeconomic variables that matter, right? Or, maybe they understood the competition and how they had to beat the competition better than other people did. By the way, we always tell startups you should never worry about your competition as a startup, which is one piece of counterintuitive advice that might not make sense to you, but our point is, and this is a Paul Grahamism, is that startups almost always die by suicide instead of murder. You will easily be the cause of your startup's death before any competition. But of course, as you grow and as the business matures and more people come into your marketplace, competition matters. And the big companies navigate that really well, and it's super hard. It's super hard to go from, I think it's Horowitz who said that that it's impossible to get from $0 to $1 million in sales. And it's super hard. But then getting from $1 million to $10 million is, doubly impossible, equally hard. Someone said getting from 10 to 100 is inevitable, and I don't know if that's true. But at each stage, you have these difficulties you have to overcome, and the ones that overcome them, that, remember, if you're at $10 million and you stay at $10 million, for years, your startup's probably worth $10 million. If you're at $10 million and you grow to $100 million in a fairly short period of time, you're worth billions. That's a huge difference. And why that happens is a whole series of variables.
Yeah. So for people in the audience who are considering an accelerator and are trying to figure out if they should do one, which one should they do, what advice would you give? I mean, obviously, you'll tell them to do YC, but let's just say they've interviewed for YC 3 times and they're not able to get in. What do you say to them? What do they do?
Well, you should
interview a 4th time.
Yeah. Well, I do think there is an increasing set of companies that get into YC that have applied before and not gotten in. I think in the last batch it was over 20 and less than 30, but in percent of the batch, something like that. So you should keep on applying to YC. I will argue that because of a lot of reasons, because I think we're good at what we do, because of our network, because of how effective we are at helping startups, that it is the best place to be for a startup. And so if you can get in, and it is hard to get in, but if you can, you should try.
Yeah.
You should not use an accelerator as a crutch. If you haven't figured out a way to get product market fit, I don't know that too many accelerators will help you. We don't actually help you get product market fit as much as illuminate the fact that you haven't reached product market fit. It's on you, right? It's on you to make something people want. And so don't use an accelerator as a crutch for that. If you think that some accelerator will help you raise money, and that you won't be able to do that otherwise because you don't have the network, or you just don't have the connections, or you need that boost of a demo day, that's fine. But beware of wasting 3 months on classes, tasks, et cetera, that don't actually move your startup forward. Because startups are like sharks in that sense. If you don't keep on moving forward, you will not survive.
Yeah, I agree 100% there. I applied a couple times to YC. I will say I did not get in. It's cool. I'm not salty, but
I don't.
You weren't there.
I don't think. I probably wasn't even there.
Yeah. But for those of you who have applied to accelerators many times and trying to figure out where accelerators play in your journey, I will say if you can get into a great one, do it. If you can't, don't be discouraged, because you can still have a very successful startup journey even without an accelerator.
And I will say, we started something called Startup School a few years ago.
Yep.
Actually taught it in 2018, taught it again in 2019. This year we're teaching it twice. It's awesome, and it's free, and we accept everyone who applies. It's a 10-week program usually. I think this week it might be this year it might be 9 weeks, but there's great content. You get to be part of a community, which is super important when you start a startup, because we all need that, whether it's within our own startup or other people who are sharing that experience. It gives us that social validation that helps make the next hard step doable. And so I totally recommend that you do Startup School. It is true that doing Startup School is a good boost into the application for YC. We love to see that people have done Startup School. It gives us a ton of information about you, which is really helpful when we try to decide whether you are going to be funded or not.
Awesome. And when you all talk to graduates of YC, what is it that is the most valuable aspect? Is it the content? Is it the network? Is it the community? What is kind of the essence of what has made YC so successful, and what has made it so valuable to founders?
Yeah, that's also a multi-part equation. You get different things from different people depending on when you ask them and how they think about it, 1 year out, 5 years out, or even 10 years out.
Yeah.
One thing that people say a lot, and this is a super important thing for startups too, is that one of the things they learned while being at YC was how to focus on what's important and just to really focus at the exclusion of everything else. That's what we tell people when you're doing YC. It's the perfect excuse to tell your best friend who is asking you to help move that you can't, you're too busy, you're doing YC, you're focused.
Yeah.
And sometimes actually our companies years out go back onto YC time when everyone just gets this incredible focus and does nothing but focus on their startup. I like to say something else too. A lot of times people think that the reason to do YC is because we help you raise money. It's true. Demo Day is the YC Demo Day is different than anything you could ever experience elsewhere. It's 1,000 investors over a couple of days, and the vast majority of YC startups raise money. But the thing that I think we do that is maybe separate from that, maybe connected, is that we really help you believe as a startup. Not that you have a good idea, not that you're a smart person or a good founder, but we help you believe that you really can be that billion-dollar company. We are pretty good now after 50 years at helping people create and see a path towards being a multi-billion-dollar company. And coming out of YC like that, that's kind of like a superpower. Really believing that you're the next Drew Houston, Brian Chesky, Collison Brothers, you name it. Mm-hmm. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah. Curious if you're evaluating applications and you don't see a path for a business to become a billion-dollar company, is that a non-starter for you?
Yeah, it is. We are funding startups. And startups are fast-growing companies that can become multi-billion-dollar companies. By the way, that doesn't mean that that's not a great outcome. Creating a business that is a lifestyle business where you have a great set of employees, a great income, a great revenue stream is fantastic. The only catch is it doesn't tend to be venture financeable.
Absolutely.
So you have to figure out a way to bootstrap that. And so our whole system is predicated on venture financeable companies.
Yep.
Except we do fund nonprofits as well, which is a little different.
So talk to me a little bit about that, because I didn't know that you all fund nonprofits. What's the thinking there as far as why was that added as part of the YC strategy?
Yeah, it was added about 8 years ago now. Our first nonprofit was a company called WOTC. Look, the thing about, the reason most of us are at YC is to have a positive change in the world. And a significant positive change, a scalable change. So we're trying to fund companies that make something people want and make something lots and lots of people want. That's the ultimate goal. Nonprofits can do the same thing. They can change the world in a super positive way if they're scalable, if they can do things that can affect tens, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people. So we have funded, I think, over 40 nonprofits now that we believe can have a really strong positive impact on society. You know, companies like WOTC that help fund medical procedures for people around the world who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford them, or companies like Women Who Code, which is trying to change sort of that strange thing that happened somewhere in the last 50 years where the original programmers were all women, and then somewhere along the line it became they were all men. But since programmers are going to be at the center of value creation, that was sort of the original epiphany Paul Graham had, well, the more women who are doing that, the better. So companies like that are really making a difference, and we're happy to fund them.
Absolutely. So that kind of inspires me for this next question, which is around YC and diversity and inclusion and equity. Curious your thoughts on how YC is kind of taking a stance on those topics today. What is YC doing? How is YC addressing the inequities that exist in Silicon Valley? Just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, if you look at the diversity in our batches, they more or less reflect the applicant pool. And so if you look at our last batch, something like, for example, 28% of the applicant pool and 28% of the batch had a woman founder. Smaller numbers for Black and Hispanic. The thing that we can do then is to make the applicant pool more diverse. And the way we do that is in a couple of ways. We do outreach. We go to historically Black colleges, places like Clark University.
Howard, maybe?
What's that?
Howard?
I don't think we've been to Howard. We've been to Morehouse.
Okay. You should go to Howard. That's where I went to school.
That we should go to Howard.
You know?
There's a lot of shoulds, and we're always open to how we can make a difference, because look, it helps us. There's great founders that are not founding companies in every underrepresented group, and we think it's great for YC and great for the world if those people become entrepreneurs. So we kind of go out and talk about the gospel of entrepreneurship, if you will. But we've also funded companies that have an impact there, like Jopwell, for example. And so we're trying in multiple ways to actually make a difference there. Awesome. And as we do, the applicant pool will hopefully get more and more diverse.
Very good. So we're almost out of time. The last question I want to ask you is about, given that you see so many companies, I'm really curious about what are the areas that are most interesting. I know you all usually publish sort of thoughts on the interesting trends and areas, but particularly outside of the Valley, since kind of bringing it back to that part of the conversation, what are the industries, the trends, the areas where you think people should be starting businesses and maybe they're not? Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
I always avoid this question, tactically, because we do have requests for startups.
Yeah.
Where we think there's big ideas that can happen. That might be in carbon sequestration, in energy. Cheap, plentiful, clean energy has huge impact if it can be done. We've actually funded 2 nuclear power companies that make small, clean reactors that could make a huge difference in those areas. And of course, there's in education and other areas that we think are impactful. But we tend not to be prescriptive. We let the applicants, the founders of these great companies, come to YC and create what they will. There's lots of areas that are going to make a huge difference in the future. We are focusing a lot right now in biotech, and we've just done an event out on the East Coast in bio, which is a little new for us. But other than that, we'll let founders figure out what the new great technologies of the future are, and we'll just help them be successful.
Awesome. Well, I'll go a layer deeper on that question.
Okay.
To you personally, what are some of the areas that really kind of spark your interest and curiosity? I think you started businesses in a number of industries, so just kind of curious on what is interesting to you personally.
It's a little bit of a strange story how I joined YC, because when I joined YC, I started a company at exactly the same time called Imagine K-12,
Yeah.
which was an educational technology version of YC, and Paul convinced me to be a partner at the same time. He said, you can start a startup and have another job. It's really easy.
Fair.
Okay, that's like the worst startup advice he ever gave in general, but it actually worked for us because it was smart to learn at YC and to do Imagine K-12 at the same time. In 2016, we merged Imagine K-12 back into YC.
Yeah.
That's all to say that education is near and dear. If you want to change, to my heart, if you want to change the trajectory of somebody of a family, then improving their education and creating equity and excellence there, there's no stronger, no more impactful thing you can do. So that's always near and dear to me. I also am a huge proponent of some of the new biotechnologies that I think are going to change the world. They're scary, but also they have huge potential for human flourishing and well-being, and I think those are great. Technologies like CRISPR and other sort of synthetic biology technology are awesome. And of course, the people talk about AI a lot. I think you should think about that as a horizontal technology. Horizontal in the sense that it will be applicable to sort of every company that people are starting out there at some point, because adding cognition into the works of what we do has the potential to make it much better, more effective, and do incredible things for us.
100% agree. Yes. Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end it on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you
guys.